Kia ora, welcome to Parliament TV. Over the next hour, we present items from the TVNZ collection, from archives held by Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision, to remember the politics from our past.
Sir Robert Muldoon was a Member of Parliament for 32 years. He was Prime Minister for nearly 9 years. He retired in 1991. This Frontline programme was broadcast on the 18th of November that year. The presenter was Lindsay Pergo.
Good evening, welcome to this special edition of Frontline. Well, Sir Robert Muldoon was very much the man of the moment again today, capturing the limelight and his departure from politics, much as he did during his years as Finance Minister and Prime Minister. Tonight, we review his career and hear some assessments of Sir Robert's years at the top. Two of our guests are fiercely supportive of what have been called his abrasive leadership style and interventionist economic policies. Our other three guests are likely to be less supportive. They are Sir Robert Jones, who joins us from Sydney. It was his formation of the New Zealand Party in 1984 that contributed heavily to the Muldoon government's defeat in that year's election. In our Beehive studio is Michael Cox, one-time junior whip in the Muldoon government. In our Auckland studio we have Dr Michael Bassett, historian and former Labour Cabinet Minister in the Kirk and Longy administrations. Also with us in Auckland and on the more supportive side, a former National Cabinet Minister under Sir Robert, Dr Ian Shearer. And in Christchurch, Mr Bert Walker, a former Minister and another close colleague of Sir Robert. Mr Walker, you'll recall, was instrumental in setting up the Sunday Club, designed to keep the Muldoon influence and philosophy to the fore in the National Party. Now, watching proceedings from his home on Auckland's North Shore is the man himself. He'll have the last word at the end of tonight's programme. Some would say he always did. First, though, Richard Harman looks back on one of the most remarkable careers in the history of New Zealand politics.
Thanks very much, Bill. It's a sad moment for you.
He entered on the political stage in 1960. Viscount Cobham was Governor-General, Walter Nash led Labour, and Keith Holyoake was Prime Minister. Sir Robert had beaten the Labour member, Bob Tizard, for the East Auckland seat of Tamaki. It embraced the affluent St Heliers as well as the rapidly developing Glen Innes state housing area. It was a period in New Zealand history when politicians talked about how to spend the proceeds from our pastoral exports. Health, education, roads and hydro dams were the very stuff of politics. With colleagues like Lance Adam Snyder and Peter Gordon, Sir Robert had been part of a backbench group known as the Young Turks, gingering up their older front bench leaders. In 1964, Sir Robert became Under-Secretary to the Minister of Finance in the Holyoake government.
I do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance.
I've referred to the fact that there'll be 4 or 5, at least, Young Turks coming in during the term of the next Parliament. I won't say when. Now, this is how we keep vitality and strength in our party, I think.
By the standards of the time, Sir Robert was a thoroughly modern man. Who better to oversee the introduction of decimal currency?
We've been doing our best to make the public feel that it's not going to be too bad, but I'm sure there'll be public apprehension up until the time of the changeover. And after that, people will be saying, well, what were we worrying about?
Sir Robert never challenged Sir Keith Holyoake. When the old man retired in 1972, Muldoon became deputy to leader Jack Marshall. Few believed he would be content with the number 2 slot for long. National was beaten that year by Norman Kirk, and Labour's claim that it was time for a change. Sir Robert began to privately hint that the same question might be asked of National's leadership. He wrote a book, The Rise and Fall of a Young Turk.
Mr. Muldoon, why did you decide to write the book in the first place?
I have a tremendous admiration for Keith Holyoake, and I thought that the real story of the Holyoake government should be written by someone who was there, saw it happen from the inside.
And slowly, he got his numbers together. In June 1974, he was to move. He became leader of the opposition and ready to launch the most intense election campaign we've ever seen in this country. After Norman Kirk died in September that year, Sir Robert stormed the country, laying about the government's profligate economic policies and rubbishing his opponents.
Put your hands up, the Labour Party supporters. That's about the typical proportion, about 0.5%. There they are. Five of them down the back, unrepentant. Good on you. That's loyalty. Not all that bright, but it's loyal.
Bill Rolling was easy meat for Muldoon and supporters like Bob Jones, whose Capital Club typed the Labour leader a mouse. Muldoon himself called Rolling a shiver looking for a spine to run up. National ran a rough campaign. Its TV ad showed dancing Cossacks and unflattering portraits of Pacific Island migrants. It was a campaign designed to pander to the electorate's fears. Muldoon created a new national voter, Rob's mob, ordinary blokes and their wives, certainly not the affluent Tories who were the party's traditional base. He took Labour's majority of 23 and reversed it. National had a landslide. He decided to be his own Minister of Finance. In his first years in power, he followed orthodox economic theory, he listened to Treasury, and he delivered to Rob's mob national super. In effect, a universal pension, now recognised to be fiscally unsustainable in the long run. Muldoon could be cruel. He accused former Labour Minister Colin Moyle of illicit homosexual activity.
I don't think that I should talk detail because I haven't seen the file.
Moyle had to resign. Ironically, the by-election for his seat was won by David Longy. In an indirect way, Muldoon had triggered his own destruction. And in the streets, he faced demonstrations from mainly younger voters. On abortion, some opposed to sporting contacts with South Africa, worried about the SIS, and of course, trade unionists, who Muldoon constantly baited with threats of voluntary unionism, even while he stuck rigidly to a centralised wage bargaining structure. It was a remarkably nondescript campaign in 1978. National simply said it had kept its word. It worked, even if Muldoon was to end up halving his majority from 23 to 11. But as the economy began to reel under high inflation fuelled by international oil price hikes, Muldoon had to face a new intake of MPs and ministers less impressed with his own personal strengths. And in 1979, we began to see what we now most easily recognise as Muldoonism, economic regulation. First, the Carless Days scheme. Meanwhile, the government itself was getting into business with the development of the Maui oil field. Later, these schemes were to be bound up in the Think Big program, now discredited by Labour because of the huge finance costs incurred in the project loans guaranteed by the Muldoon government. In 1979, the Federation of Labour elected Jim Knox as its president. An increasingly militant left-wing influence within the FOL meant their relationship with Muldoon was going to be doomed. Muldoon himself, as much as the economy, was now the issue. His confrontational style, the way he kicked listener cartoonist Tom Scott out of a press conference.
Somebody from my staff here. Take it away, will you?
Muldoon called it counterpunching. His critics called it bullying.
Prime Minister, it's customary in an interview for the interviewer to ask questions and for them to be answered singly.
I'm not much interested in what's customary.
In the one-house, two-mortgage suburbs, Muldoonism meant high interest rates. Social credit capitalised on this and won a by-election in East Coast Bays. Muldoon was on the back foot, facing a caucus rebellion, the so-called Colonel's coup. He summonsed his personal supporters, Rob's mob.
All these fierce attacks coming, and then people were coming in reverse, and all of a sudden there was a surge of, oh, good old Rob, you know, that sort of thing. So Rob's mob's in business again.
But Muldoon was not challenged. Instead, the caucus backed down. National was now bitterly divided, though. Muldoon once said he preferred his cabinet to have a ton of loyalty rather than an ounce of cleverness. But old mates like Colin McLaughlin were becoming embarrassments. In 1981, the rugby union invited the Springboks. The national government refused to intervene. The stage was set for a massive confrontation. But the 1981 campaign was not to be fought on the Springbok issue, or even really Muldoon's style. Instead, he went to places like the smelter town of Bluff and incessantly put the case for Think Big.
That's why we're building them. Selling energy for overseas funds. We've got it. We must sell it.
National was to end up after the election with a two-seat majority.
In spite of all the nonsense and in spite of all these promises, my gosh, they promised them everything. And finally the people said, nope, we don't believe you, and there's not going to be a change of government.
As he took time out at his Hatfields Beach Batch that Christmas, He must have known 1982 was going to be an even tougher year. His slim majority meant the caucus would have even more power. Probably a quarter were resolutely opposed to him. The Think Big projects were starting to become a reality, but there was little to show for them. Inflation was still around 15 or 16%, the balance of payments deficit was rising, and government borrowing was starting to climb. Something had to give. And it did, with this appearance by Associate Finance Minister Derek Quigley, a colonel from the attempted coup of 1980, on Ian Fraser's Newsmakers show.
Well, I'm surprised that the
Quigley questioned the Think Big programme.
I've accepted the resignation of Mr. D.F. Quigley from his cabinet posts.
As requested by you, I hereby resign as Minister of Works and Development and Minister of Housing and as a member of the Executive Council.
Then Muldoon chanced his interventionist arm once too often.
Most New Zealanders today believe that inflation is our #1 enemy, and they're right.
It was the intervention to end all interventions. He froze all wages and prices, and he was proud of it.
If we, the government, did not intervene in the economy and assist our farmers, if we said, no, we're going to bring down the internal deficit, we're going to cut out the fertiliser subsidy, cut out the SMPs, cut out all the other assistance that we give to our farmers and our manufacturers, we would literally, today, have farmers walking off their farms.
Think Big, the Quigley sacking and the freeze had now turned the financial and business establishment against Muldoon. The mood was ripe for someone to take him on.
Too late now.
Meanwhile, Muldoon's long-time ally, Bob Jones, had defected in protest against the economic policies to form the New Zealand Party. Jones spoke for many one-time national voters when he explained why.
I've always accepted that the Prime Minister is a man of, to use labels, of socialist tendencies.
The caucus was beginning to worry too. They wanted change. They sent a signal with the election of Jim Macleay as Deputy Prime Minister.
Here he is, you man.
But Jim Macleay couldn't erode the Muldoon government's image as old and tired, an image reinforced by TV footage of the late-night rambles of Cabinet Minister Keith Allen. Sir Robert plainly enjoyed the pomp that went with his job. He'd been knighted earlier in the year, but within Parliament itself, he was constantly being challenged. Backbenchers threatened to cross the floor and eliminate his slender majority of one. He ruled increasingly by regulation. Interest rates were hit again, but in June, when Marilyn Waring refused to vote with the government against a Labor nuclear-free bill, it was all over.
We got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give you much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
Is the House dissolved tomorrow, is it?
The House won't meet tomorrow. The Governor-General is going to prorogue Parliament tonight, and the House won't meet tomorrow. And so, all right, we're away and seeing who the people want to govern this country.
National got off to a desultory start at the Wellington Town Hall. Labour's leader portrayed Muldoon as a one-man band, out of control.
I see his campaigning as exactly as we had calculated he would campaign. We have a $17 billion overseas debt, we have more than 100,000 unemployed, and he's talking about my suit.
And then, in an extraordinary incident, Sir Robert seemed to crack with an aside to Mr. Longy during the TV leaders' debate that he loved him.
Thank you. I give them after July 15 the chance to do that.
Thank you very much, Mr.
I
Longy.
love you, Mr. Longy.
Thank you.
It was very gracious of you to ring. Thank you very much. I'll see you on Monday.
3 years from now, they'll be saying Rob Muldoon was right. Rob, come back.
He tried to cling to power.
If Mr. Longy has got any sense at all, and up until this moment on this thing, he has not displayed it, he will come out with me and say, we will not devalue the New Zealand dollar.
That was really his last political gasp. He lost the leadership to Jim Macleay later that year and seemed to drift off into a world of theatrics and a futile attempt via the Sunday Club to revive the good old days. And then, after he'd helped dump Macleay, he misjudged National's next leader, Jim Bolger.
Jim Bolger represents, if you like, a middle-of-the-road National Party approach.
As the party moved further from his interventionist approach, he was becoming more critical of party economic policy.
I think they've just got to realise that the public won't wear Rogernomics in any form in the future.
And he began subtly to undermine Bolger with his support of Winston Peters.
I want to say tonight, without apology, that the mad monetarist experiment of Roger Douglas was continued by the surrogate finance minister, Mr. Cagle, in his mini-budget of the last month.
Then the illness. At the end of 1989, he had open heart surgery. For days, he lay at death's door. Typically, he barred the hospital from issuing press statements about himself. He played little formal part in National's 1990 election campaign. It was no surprise that he wasn't in Jim Bolger's cabinet. But he promised to keep fighting.
Not a thorn, maybe a little prick.
Then, as he saw the super scheme that had launched him into power in 1975 cut back, he went public, appearing at protest meetings. But he began to seem increasingly irrelevant.
Never believe what you see on television.
And then, at the National Caucus that revised that super scheme, he made his famous threat to resign. Yesterday, he carried it out. His career's really been over since he lost the '84 election. Even those last few years as Prime Minister, all the bluster, all the bullying, all the distractions couldn't disguise the fact that really he didn't have an economic miracle, but such was the extent of his political dominance that hardly anyone dared argue with him. He calls himself an ordinary bloke. He's anything but.
Richard Harman with that report. When we come back, our panel's verdict on the Muldoon years. Welcome back to this Frontline special on the Muldoon years. Now, at this point, we're going to hear what no doubt will be conflicting perspectives from our invited guests as to what those years add up to. Beginning, if I may, with you, Bob Jones in Sydney. Now, you were angered by his economic policies, especially towards the end of his tenure. In fact, the incoming Labour government implemented many of the measures you and your New Zealand party advocated. I wonder, in the light of everything that's happened since, does he seem so bad in retrospect?
Oh, I think I was always consistent about that, Lindsay. I could never rubbish him because there were so many things that were fantastic about him. He was absolutely wrong on the economic thing, but I mean, if we look at him today, he's still wrong about that. I mean, for the first, he says he's resigned because of the policies vis-a-vis the National Party traditional practices. But in terms of the National, I mean, the National Party is nearly 60 years old. This is the first ever national government that's ever adhered to its founding principles that are clearly written out. I mean, it's the first time we've ever had one. But having said that, he's right about a lot of other things. I mean, he's absolutely right. This is a government that is a government of liars. They lied to the electorate. This is a much more important issue because it threatens our very democracy. And they willfully and deliberately set out and lied, and I find that just reprehensible. And he's quite right about that issue. But just a couple of comments, if I may, because I took a few notes listening. We didn't get you on the screen here. You mentioned you were going to get the panel verdict on the Muldoon years. It sounds a bit like an obituary. I would suggest to you they're not over yet, those years. I think we may see Muldoon quite an influential figure. You know, I don't think we'll see him in boards and things. Quite an influential figure in our political scene because he's going to be very devastating to this government from outside it. And I'd just like to put my hand up and endorse the comments you made, and I wrote it down. One of the most remarkable careers in the history of our politics, absolutely, no question about that. He stands with Longy as the two most remarkable politicians of this century. Longy, because it was a wee bit different, he was a visionary. He did radical things. Muldoon was the ultimate politician and quite an extraordinary one.
Well, Bert Walker in Christchurch, at least on that, I imagine you would agree with Bob Jones.
No, I certainly do not. I would say that During my time in Parliament, I served under 5 different Prime Ministers, and they all had their strengths and their weaknesses, but Rob Muldoon was clearly the most outstanding Prime Minister during that period of time, and I believe he will go down in history as one of the greatest, or one of the 2 greatest, if not the greatest Prime Ministers that New Zealand has had this century.
But what was a socialist doing leading the National Party, Mr Walker? That's what Bob Jones would say, I think. On the economy, he was wrong.
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
Bob Jones would say that where Sir Robert Muldoon erred was in the realm of the economy, that he practiced socialist policies. Now, what business did a socialist have being leader of the National Party?
Well, let's put it this way. When Sir Robert went out of office in 1984, we had a growth rate of 8.6%, the highest growth rate of all the countries in the OECD. At the same time, we had an inflation rate of 4.5%, and people were generally prosperous. Today, we're down to 2% or lower, which is about starvation point, and we have record unemployment. I will back Rob Muldoon's policies anytime, anywhere.
Well, Michael Cox, you were part of the government in those days. In fact, it was part of your job to try to hold it together, which became increasingly difficult. You went on to become National's finance spokesman. What do you think, in retrospect, of Sir Robert's financial policies?
Well, let's start off with Bert Walker's comments that, you know, he had 4% inflation and 8.6% growth, brought about by a 14-month freeze. Let's look at the real figures over those 9 years, which I think are the root cause of many of the problems that the current government is trying to solve. You look at your inflation figure, it ran at 12.22%. on an average over those 9 years. Your real growth ran at 1.2% over those 9 years, and your public debt went up by 20.19%. And I've got the actual figures today because I know you don't bandy loose figures around with Rob Muldoon. So basically, the problem started then, and the sad thing was, in '75 we had the mandate to go out and cure some of the problems that had been caused because the golden goose had died and the Brits were in the EC and so forth. We didn't do it. It was a giveaway government. Anyone can be popular when they say yes to anyone. In actual expenditure during that time, you know, the results of saying yes to everyone went from 26% of all we produced, GDP, to 38%.
But Michael, if it stopped people walking off farms, isn't that a good thing? Didn't that help the economy overall?
Well, it didn't. Of course, the crunch finally came when you had runaway inflation in your internal economy because you were cost-plussing, and you were using the taxes from that to feed to the farmers who were missing out on international markets and giving them SMPs. And the international markets had finally got to a stage where they said, hey, stop, you can't do this. And we were running out of people who were going to lend us money. Now, that was the critical problem. And we're still, I mean, the Labour Party tried to attack it. They never could because they were socialists themselves. But finally, those problems have come home to roost, and they have to be attacked. Now,
all right,
it disappoints me to see Rob attacking
sorry,
those.
Michael, I'll come back to you. You were there at the time, yes. Shearer. I think your view of Sir Robert's economic policies is a little more positive than the one we just heard.
Very much so. I was there when the coup of 1980 occurred. I never heard anything coming from Michael Cox or Derek Quigley or Jim Bolger, who was in line for the deputy leadership at that time, that suggested that they had any of the answers that they seem to have at the present time. So I think that's the answer to that. I think what we're missing here with all of these figures that Michael Cox is quoting is that we're here to talk about the man, and I think the two things that came through in that earlier snippet were the fact that he played a great amount of store on loyalty, and a substantial number of his cabinet colleagues were not prepared to show the same loyalty that he gave to them. And I think honesty, and I think at the present time the general public would say that the only people that take politicians seriously are other politicians. And I think that is a change that has occurred since the time that Rob Muldoon was there as leader.
But if you're talking about loyalty to principles that are not strictly National Party principles, it's not disloyal, really, to be disloyal to such a leader.
Well, I believe that he held firmly to the principles that were there as National Party principles at the time. And some may interpret some of those principles as being socialistic. But if you look at the National Party principles as outlined in those early days, there were some principles there associated with socialist views because of the times that they were framed in.
Well, Michael Bassett, you were part of the government that had to deal directly with the Muldoon government legacy, both as a political opponent, as an historian. What do you think the history books should say?
Well, they'll definitely say that Muldoon was one of the most intelligent prime ministers in New Zealand history, probably second only to David Lange. In terms of his sort of instinctive political feel, the equal of Seddon, Fraser and Massey, but he unfortunately came at the end of a period of 40 years of welfarism, at a time when the engine that was generating the wherewithal for that sort of welfarism was spluttering and dying away, and Muldoon loaded onto it the biggest single welfare addition in the history of New Zealand in the form of the national superannuation scheme. And we subsequently had a number of other really big expenditures which the superstructure was just simply not able to handle. And I think that history will indicate that the intention was good, but that the country was not in a position, unfortunately, to do it.
So you think the superannuation scheme was his biggest mistake?
Yes. Oh, it's undoubtedly the biggest election bribe in New Zealand history. It supersedes Sir Joseph Ward's 70 million loan in 1928.
Bert Walker, what do you make of that?
Oh, well, I wouldn't go along with that at all. Matter of fact, I recall reading Dr. Bassett's book on the waterfront strike. I think the strike was before he was born, and that accounts for what he had to say in his book. And that's about the same thing as I say about his national superannuation. National superannuation was described around the world as the finest piece of social legislation yet introduced. It was affordable when it was introduced, and it would be affordable today in its original form if we had a growth rate of 3% per annum. And remember, when Sir Robert went out, the growth rate was 8.6%. So there's no question about it. It was a good scheme. We could afford it then, and we could afford it again with the 3% growth rate. Now, the other point I'd like to mention is the matter was raised of overseas debt. Now, I know that the figures being quoted by Sir Robert's opponents will include the cost of the Think Big projects. I haven't heard it said, and I didn't hear it read out in the budget, that this year there was a net return to New Zealand from the Think Big projects of $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion net.
But with respect, the actual cost of servicing the loans that were involved in actually funding all of that would be somewhat in excess of 1.5 billion per year.
No, that's quite incorrect. That is a net figure. The total, there's 1.8 billion income, of which 3% of that.
Well, he's saying we're $1.5 billion a year better off. Bob Jones in Sydney, we haven't forgotten you. Do you want to talk about Think Big for a moment?
Yes, certainly.
Well, I don't think there's any question that history will record that as a mistake, Lindsay. I mean, as a political exercise, it was very interesting, and I can recall a meeting at my house with just prior to the 81 election, and I'll tell you who was there, and I won't tell you who was there. Muldoon was not there, but there were top National Party people there, including Derek Quigley. And it was just prior to the election, and Derek, and I say this to his credit, was vehemently opposed to the whole proposition. He said, the numbers don't add up, why are we doing it? And Muldoon's top brass, who were there, he was not, was saying, who cares? It's a great election ploy, it sounds great. Now, you know, that was
all right, let's take up that point.
That was the
election
sort of mood
ploy?
at the time.
Was Think Big an election ploy, Ian?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think Big was in any way an election ploy, because it was an essential element at the time. As we all know, there were the oil shocks.
That's absolutely rubbish.
No, we all know about the oil shocks at the time, and it's all right in hindsight to look back and say, OK, we got through that problem. But at the point that the Think Big decisions were being made, we were in fairly severe straits as far as our oil supplies were concerned, and that had to be taken into account.
They went way beyond oil there were steel works, there were a lot of schemes.
Doesn't it make sense, though, Bob, to be...
with energy utilisation.
And doesn't it make sense to be much more self-sufficient in energy when we're dealing with an area of the world where there's trouble regularly?
Well, the question really becomes...
No, because it's inconsistent. It's inconsistent with the... This is the whole thing about the Muldoon era. Now, let me make it very clear that I think that there are a lot more pluses about Muldoon, and I've always said this, and I'll go on saying it because they're true. A lot more pluses about Muldoon than negatives, but we're talking about one of the negatives, and that's one of them. It was a political ploy with some of his colleagues. I don't think it was with him because he's fundamentally a very honest man. He's a man of great integrity, and I admire him for that. And that's one of the things that's motivated this decision yesterday, because he deplores so strongly the blatant and willful lying that went on in the last election. Nevertheless, he made a mistake with the Think Big, and to talk about it in an energy context is totally wrong and dishonest, because it was more than energy. It was the state going into a whole range of areas, and it was a cock-up, and history has shown it was a cock-up, and for Ian to dismiss it is all very well in hindsight. Awful lot of people were saying it at that time, including Derek Quigley, so it's not a lot of people saying it in hindsight. Lots of people, and Ian's memory, I'm quite sure, can recall the vehement opposition to a lot of those schemes from people on quite scientific, accounting and other bases.
All right, we really have to move on from Think Big, but Michael Bassett, we heard Bob Jones say there, even he would concede that Sir Robert is a man of great integrity. Is that a view you share?
I think he was a man of fairly considerable integrity. You have to question sometimes some of the things that he did. I mean, the Moyle affair certainly won't go down in his book as a plus.
And yet that was a counterpunch, though, wasn't it? Colin Moyle started that exchange.
He
they tended to be trivial things, though,
didn't they? He argues that, very trivial. He was a couple of times before the courts on libel cases. Everybody knows
what's wrong with that?
That's inevitable
for Bob Jones, I guess. But, I mean, you know, the guy's record was certainly one of attack. But having said all of that, New Zealanders tend to like their politicians like that. I mean, Seddon, who was the greatest success of them all, was the most rambunctious also, and so were most of the other successful ones, Massey and Fraser. I don't really feel that being a tough politician is a bad thing.
All right, I was not asking about toughness so much as integrity and honesty, though. Michael Cox, you worked with him, a man of integrity?
More a man of a more political animal than one of integrity, frankly. And but you know, I think we've strayed into the minutiae. We actually should be talking about the basic philosophies that drove the man. You know, I've always had him as a socialist. He increased the role of the state at a time when we couldn't afford it, and we borrowed, and I mean, that's the way you hung on to
where
power.
were you at that time, Michael? You were in the House and you were backing him. Where were you?
I was one of the colonels, as you know, Bob, and came to your house.
Now, that's not right, Michael.
And came to your house many times, Bob.
You were there at that meeting that I allude to, and you thought that was a very smart political thing to do, even though Derek argued with you that it didn't add up in the numbers. Now, I mean, yeah, where was your integrity?
There were three
people there. There were three people there.
You went out and argued against a consumption tax when the Labor government brought it in, even though you had made your whole political career in favour of that.
Yes, and
so,
Bob,
you know, don't challenge Muldoon's integrity.
Yeah,
Michael Cox, have you been exposed here as a socialist after all?
Pardon?
Have you been exposed here as a socialist? No, he's not?
Not
it sounds as though he once was.
And let me be the first to say that opposing the GST was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made, and I admit to that. Now, I think we should.
But you did it for political reasons,
Bob,
didn't you?
Bob, why don't you wrap up for a little while?
Yes, wrap up, Bob.
Yeah, we can hear you from Sydney. And I enjoyed the meal we had with you that night, and there were, you know, Jim McClay, Derek Quigley, and myself. Those were the three that were there.
Yeah, that's right.
And we were interested in what you were saying at that time, of course, too. But I think we've got to look at what has actually happened, and I believe, and what really hurts me now is when I hear Rob Muldoon, who insisted on loyalty, just taking his own people apart, particularly every Sunday on that radio program.
I agree
in
with
Auckland.
you there.
And I think that's lousy.
I agree with you there.
And because these people are left with what he created, and they're actually trying to actually solve the problem.
That's one of the negative
Well, thank you, Bob.
sides.
It's nice to know you agree with me.
All right,
Yeah, I do.
one of the
that's
frequently
nasty
voiced...
side of it.
Hang on, Bob. One of the frequently voiced criticisms of him, in fact, is that he debased the currency of political debate. Now, some of these issues have arisen already tonight. Did he, or was he just another Seddon and some of the other people that you mentioned, Michael?
Well, I mean, I think that Seddon did his best in the minds of many people at that time to debase the currency. He certainly was an incredibly tough operator in the House. He could, and he still does, use statistics unscrupulously. I mean, we heard tonight Bert, who I think is his mouthpiece, if you don't mind me saying, Bert, saying that there was an 8% growth rate at the time he went out of office in 1984. There might have been encapsulated for about 1 month of his 8.5 years a growth rate of that level, but there certainly wasn't for the 8.5 years. The inflation rate, you know, he would tell you about how it had gotten down to 4.5%. I mean, it's half that now, but everybody knows that it had only been brought down as a result of the wage price freeze, and that for most of the period from 75 to 80, it was in double digits plus. And so when it came to actually being scrupulous in argument, he was the last person of whom that could be said.
Bert Walker, you were Minister of Social Welfare in his cabinet. What was he like in cabinet? Was he the bully that some people portrayed him as? Did he take heed of criticism? Did he welcome dissent?
No, he... what is said about him that he was a one-man band, that is totally incorrect. Nothing was ever brought into the House in the form of legislation until that had been thoroughly discussed by caucus, and Cabinet had approved it and sent it back to caucus. Everybody had to have their say, because there's quite a difference, no matter what the topic is. When you think of people in Auckland, will that also suit the people in the Bluff?
All right, but how did he deal with people who disagreed with him?
He thrashed out anything that people disagreed with until in the end.
Until they agreed with him?
Until the end, caucus as a whole had reached a consensus. And at that point, when there was sufficient support for it in caucus, it was then taken into the House. But he was not
correct, Ian Shearer?
He was not a one-man band.
What Bert says is strictly true. I can remember on several occasions crossing swords with Rob on certain matters. Certainly on the environment, Rob didn't have a strong feeling for the environment, and yet he was prepared to accept the criticisms that I levelled on various occasions, and even went to the point where he was prepared to put me into the Cabinet as Minister for the Environment, even after I'd crossed the floor on the National Development Bill. So there's no truth in this fiction that's been spread around that he was a dictatorial fellow in Cabinet. The thing that happened, and in caucus, the thing that happened was that people that didn't come prepared to put forward their argument in caucus or Cabinet were given a pretty tough time from Rob, because he expected the Cabinet ministers particularly, but all caucus, to know what they were talking about and be well prepared before they spoke.
I can give you 3 examples, Lindsay, of where that didn't happen in the caucus.
Just one will do, Michael. We're running out of time.
Let's look at the freeze. I don't know what happened in Cabinet, but in caucus we were never told about that. Take the income tax number 2 bill. Never told about that. Pottery taxes,
That's not
that
true.
sort of thing.
That second one is definitely not true, because I can recall the debate that we had in caucus on that particular issue.
All right, gents.
Maybe you were away that day, Michael.
Finally and briefly, Sir Robert said when he came into power that he wanted to leave the country no worse than it was when he found it. Now, did he succeed in that objective?
He most certainly did not. You know, the state of New Zealand today is a tribune from Sir Robert. The size of the debt that was left at the point when my government came to power was just crippling, and we've been trying for the last 7 years, and the present government is trying as well, to dig its way out from under the legacy of Rob Muldoon. It's a tragedy, but we are having to live with it.
Bert Walker, did he succeed in his objective?
Yes, he did, because when he went out in 1984, certainly was undermined by some of the right-wing section of the organisation, but things were fairly prosperous in New Zealand at that time. The problems we suffered since then has been Rogernomics in the first place, a failed policy which has been continued by the present Minister of Finance.
Very quickly, Bob Jones.
No, he failed in that. There can be no dispute about that, but he was still a great politician and a great New Zealander.
Michael Cox?
he had the chance to actually improve it. He didn't. He left it in a hell of a mess, and we're still having to clean it up.
Ian Shearer.
I think many of his successes have been washed away by subsequent events. I think that he has a tremendous number of successes in the time that he was there.
All right, gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for joining us tonight. And when we come back, the final word from Sir Robert Muldoon. Welcome back to this final segment of our Frontline Special. Well, you've heard the views of our assorted guests on the legacy of Sir Robert Muldoon. Now we hear from the man himself. Sir Robert has been following our program at home. First of all, Sir Robert, is there any point that you would like to pick up on?
Well, if I had time, there would be a number of them, but perhaps if I could make a general observation, the main thrust of the introductory material was typical TVNZ. Find all the bad bits and hit them as hard as you can. And I think the public will make up their own minds. That's what my mail at the present time tells me.
All right, what are the good bits that we supposedly left out?
Well, you say supposedly.
You say we put in all the bad bits?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What did we leave out?
The bit you should have put in was the fact that my time as Prime Minister coincided with the two oil shocks that weren't mentioned in that context. That we'd barely become the government when we had to face the first oil shock, then the second one, and we found that we had reserves of energy that were much more valuable than they were when Warren Freer signed the take or pay Maui agreement, which said that we would pay for the Maui gas and oil whether we used it or not. Now that's what all those big things were all about. TVNZ's not much interested in going to that depth.
Well, the concern is with the level of debt that New Zealand incurred in the process.
Exactly, but I think it was Bert Walker that made the point that after paying interest on that debt for the Think Big projects, we still end up $1.5 million better in our overseas funds than we would have without it. But then that figure doesn't include what we would have paid to the Maori partners if we'd left it all under the sea. Now, I'm just saying to you that TVNZ very typically takes the worst of all these things in their research, and it's not you, Lindsay, it's your researchers. Let's move on to something else.
Well, there is the philosophical point that we did hear raised tonight, that whatever the arguments for such projects, it's not the business of government to be involved in things like that, not in a free enterprise economy. And you heard one or two people call you a socialist. Did you ever consider yourself...
Well, I heard, I think, was it Michael Cox?
Mm-hmm.
He was one of my whips and totally disloyal. I have no regard for Michael Cox and, frankly, no respect for his opinions.
Including the opinion that you are a socialist.
Exactly. You know, is that a terrible thing? If I was, which I'm not, I've got a monument down in my electorate to Michael Joseph Savage, and people go down there once every year and make obeisance to him. They won't make obeisance to me because I'm not a socialist, but I have no regard for the opinions of people like Cox. I knew him when he was in the House. I have no regard for him.
Sir Robert, you did say tonight to Susan Wood that there were a few things you would do differently. Not many, but a few.
Well, I wouldn't have brought in the payroll tax. That was when I was Minister of Finance. I thought it was a good idea. I told Keith Holyoake, he said, well, you know what you're doing, boys, go ahead. But then both the unions and the employers said no. And the Kirk government repealed it. So I wouldn't do that.
Is that your biggest mistake?
Well, it's the one that comes to mind. One of my mistakes, I guess, was not being tougher with one or two people in my caucus, and because he was on tonight, one of them, I guess, is Cox, who's a lightweight.
Well, many people would say that you were too tough.
Yeah, I know they would, but, you know, who are they?
Did you encourage dissent?
You see, you heard two of my ministers, not a useless whip, two of my ministers say, from their own personal knowledge, that I wasn't too tough. And they've got it right, because everything we did then, and they're not doing it today, we put past caucus, back to cabinet, waited till we got a consensus. And then I announced it, and everybody said, well, there's Rob Muldoon made another decision. But those decisions were made by cabinet and caucus in a way that's fallen out of fashion in recent years.
Now, Sir Robert, thanks for joining us tonight. We're out of time. Have a happy retirement. And that's our program for tonight. Join us again on Frontline next Sunday here on 1. Till then, good night.
That Frontline program was broadcast on the 18th of November 1991. Sir Robert Muldoon formally retired from Parliament a month later.
On our website, www.parliament.nz, you can find contemporary insights into the workings of our Parliament. In 1989, the Video Dispatch program took a look of its own.
This is the mace, the symbol of authority in Parliament. It is one of the many British traditions which New Zealand still uses. Parliament is a very important place for all New Zealanders.
Speaker, Honourable Jonathan Hunt. Some of these matters will be revealed, of course, for the honourable gentleman.
It's where the people we vote for meet to make the laws and rules which we have to live by. Our system of ruling the country is copied from the British Parliament, and even though we're responsible for making our own laws and rules, the Queen is the head of state. She sometimes opens Parliament when she visits New Zealand. The opening of Parliament is a very formal ceremony. When the Queen is not here, her representative, the Governor-General, takes her place. Neither the Queen nor the Governor-General has anything to do with making or changing the laws, but they are an important part of the process. Their signature is needed to make Parliament's decisions official.
Black Rod withdraws from the chamber and bows 3 times for proceeding to the House of Representatives.
Black Rod's an ancient office in British and Commonwealth constitutional affairs, dating all the way from the 14th century.
The lawmaking process, like the opening ceremony, is copied from parliamentary traditions in Britain.
Draw the curtain! Unlock the door! Remove the bar!
The Black Rod is sent to fetch the politicians because the Queen is not allowed into this room. The Speaker, the Prime Minister and all the other members of Parliament are led by the Black Rod to another room where the Queen awaits them.
And now Mr. Speaker leaves the chair and, preceded by Black Rod and the Sergeant-at-Arms, followed by the Clerk and Deputy Clerk of the House and members of the House, with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition leading, will proceed to the Council chamber.
Leading Mr. Speaker behind Black Rod from the chamber, through the members' gallery, into the Legislative Council chamber, to assemble before Her Majesty to hear the speech from the Queen and to have the instruction that Parliament now go about its business.
A lot of Parliament's business goes on in this room, called the Chamber of the House of Representatives. It's where the discussion and arguing goes on between members of Parliament. Carol Rankin is the Sergeant-at-Arms.
Well, the Speaker's the most important person in Parliament. And in fact, in the order of precedence in New Zealand, he's the third most important person following the Governor-General and the Prime Minister.
And what does he do? What is his role?
He presides over Parliament. It's sort of like being the chairman.
There are 97 members of Parliament. The government sits on the right. At the moment, they are Labour Party politicians.
The government members sit on this side and the opposition members sit on this side.
Right. So where does the Prime Minister sit?
The Prime Minister sits over here.
And who sits in the seats around him?
The front bench members of the Cabinet sit in the front row here. We have...
That is his ministers, the
Yes,
Minister of
that's right.
Education.
Order. Order. Are there any petitions for presentation?
Mr. Speaker, I have the...
On the left, at the moment, the National Party sits in opposition to the government. There's also one independent MP. Parliament makes decisions by voting. Sometimes that means physically walking through doors at the sides of the House. Those who agree pass through the ayes door, and those who don't through the door marked noes. The House of Representatives is also a war memorial. All the battles in which New Zealanders have fought are represented on the walls. History and tradition are very important to Parliament and therefore to the government of our country. Without these traditions, we wouldn't live in the democratic society that we now know in New Zealand.
In the lead-up to the 1996 general election, Marae broadcast a special pre-election program with candidates from the 4 main political parties, each contesting a Māori seat. This item looks at the issue of health.
Many whānau are concerned about the rising costs of health.
I'm the mother of 4 children. My oldest son is an asthmatic, and we find it really hard going to the doctors and paying for doctors' visits and prescription.
Māori health providers are seen as the answer to the financial and cultural barriers.
Māori health probably have the potential to make the biggest significant change in Māori health.
But Paparangi Reid is scathing of the regional health authorities' inadequate funding for the majority of Māori health initiatives throughout the country. She believes they're being short-sighted. She says it's better for RHAs to properly fund Māori primary health care now, or else they'll be paying for the $200 a day hospital treatment later down the track.
That would be the most cost-effective thing for all those agencies who are worried about their budget. To keep us out of hospital by keeping us well in the community. And to do that, they need good primary health care happening out there.
In the meantime, studies show that Māori adults like this are foregoing their own health needs in favour of their kids.
Kia ora tātou. What we have here is a classic example of a whānau struggling to get health care for their kids. And what worries me about this scenario is that we often look at the kids but we forget about the rest of the family. Often the rest of the family is missed out as we prioritise getting health care for our kids. There's a lot of research around showing this, and especially that Māori women in these situations have a lot of unmet needs for health care. I'd like to know from the panel what policies they have in place to ensure that the whole whānau gets health care, rather than just prioritising the kids, important as our kids are.
Well, Tony, one of the things that comes through time and time and time again is that the public don't like the health system that was established by your government and your party. What's your response to that?
Well, low-income families, community service can't hold us get free in and out access to hospitals, so it's not a financial burden. We've tried to reduce any costs in accessing hospitals. My feeling is, though, that there are serious health concerns out there, and what Māori people have got to recognise that we can't misery swap our way into the future. Here is a Māori health problem, and here is a health solution. What we're doing is we're developing policies of those solutions, and those policies are influencing our direction as Māori people. I think our direction should be influenced by our health aspirations. Here is a cultural image of an aspiration that we have, a cultural lifestyle that we want to live. We should develop our policies to fit that image of where we want to be.
Chuku, what's your response to that?
Well, the answer is two-pronged. One is at a primary health level, which means that about 8 years ago when Helen Clark was the Minister of Health, she was the person who introduced health charges. So that meant that our families had to pay to go to the doctor and pay to get prescription medicine. And the same thing with the National Party is that they're making a lot of money out of sick people. What New Zealand First is about is that we will waive the hospital charges, we will make health affordable and accessible, which means that our kids who are under the age of 12 and under will get free GP service and free prescription medicine. We will get behind successful Māori health initiatives like Raukura Hauora or Tainui, who have 9 health clinics around the Tainui region, and just last year serviced 40,000 patients. 90% of those were Māori, and they offer a free of charge GP service and prescription medicine. We believe that we'll be in the business of keeping successful Māori initiatives on the ground. Those that are presenting a poor service, we'll shut them down.
Okay, Joe.
Labor will have a health system run for people and not for profit. Labor will cut health costs. We will make sure that children under 5 years old get access to free GP visits and no standard prescription charges. Labor will scrap National's hospital charges and abolish asset testings. We say asset testing older people is wrong. It will go.
Morning.
For Tracy Matthews and others like her, Kiwi Care Health Plan will ensure that Māori have access to health care when they need it and not because they have the ability to pay for it. And she and her whānau and people like her will benefit because Kiwi Care will pay for visits to the doctor, it will pay for medical prescriptions for her. Her family and her children will have access to the hospitals without having to pay for them and access to specialists. And she will receive prompt treatment from public hospitals. We will lift the financial burden from Tracy and her whānau. And with regards to waiting lists, we've got an awful lot of our people are on those waiting lists, and they have to wait months, and some of them have to wait years. And so Kiwi Care package of the Alliance will fund hospitals so that we get rid of them.
One of the things, of course, that concerns a lot of people when Jim Anderton and other Alliance people talk about the health services and education services is the enormous cost, and it seems to be turning the clock back, which an awful lot of people are concerned about. What's your response to that?
Yeah. Well, you see, when you look at the cost, it isn't that as bad as the New Right agenda tries to spread that propaganda. The fact is that tax cuts that happened in 1996 and tax cuts that's been offered in 1997 will actually less than 50% of those tax cuts will actually allow a free education and a free health system in this country. So we're saying that a lot of people out there are prepared to pay a little bit extra tax. In fact, lower income people will pay less tax, but higher income people will pay a little bit more tax, but that will allow the rest of society to have a free education. But it's, you see, Derek, it's free for, there's free health and free education for the wealthy as well, so they are actually making on it as well.
Okay, then there's
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Because the Alliance Party are being totally irresponsible because the budget for all their policies is $4.74 billion. That means that the government surplus here and now is $1.6 billion. I want to know where they're going to get the money from, because I tell you, even if they introduce their flat transactional tax, that's not going to net enough money so that our people...
Okay.
Now,
We'll come back
these
to
guys are spreading a whole lot of propaganda, irresponsible.
He's suggesting, of course, and Jim Anderton has too, that the money that's going back into the community by way of tax cuts, which is small to individuals, could in fact cover it. But 2 points from both of you. You talked about looking after kids under the age of 12, free doctor's visits. One of the things Paparangi said in there was that we're concentrating quite a lot on the kids, but we're forgetting about other members of the family. How are you going to handle that aspect of it?
I quoted the example of Raukura Hauora.
Yep.
This is a Māori health service that we are totally supportive of because it is a whānau service. It is a service that provides holistic
Okay,
care.
You're saying we can do it though?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You were saying free medical for programs for under 5s. He's saying under 12. What are you going to do about the older ones?
Well, we are going to invest an extra $150 million into healthcare. Labor's going to blitz the waiting list. That means that our senior citizens, our old soldiers will will get medical care and attention and be when they need it and when they require it.
Dana, last word on health?
Well, I can promise excellent Māori health, because what we need is a cultural vision of where we want Māori health to be. What we're hearing here is an explanation of our party policies. I mean, I know that I can visualise thousands of Māori people exercising every day, kohanga reos training every day, and I know we just established health and fitness centres on marae that have GPs.
That's the answer, you say?
Yeah.
For some contemporary insights into the workings of Parliament, you can view a collection of short videos from the Spotlight on Parliament series. Just head to the New Zealand Parliament website at www.parliament.nz.